Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. Today, I am really pleased to be talking about Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane. Longtime listeners of the Fox Page will recognize that this is a slightly different genre. We usually do not do a lot of crime/thriller/suspense work, but longtime listeners also know that I am obsessed with Ireland and with Irish literature. This interest in Irish literature has taken on a slightly new nuance, and while I have not generally been a big reader of the Irish diaspora, I have always been really interested in the notion of the large Irish population in Boston. I don't think I've talked a lot about this, but I went to school in New Hampshire at Dartmouth College, so I spent a lot of time coming in and out of Boston and spent many a weekend there and had a real affinity even before I met my husband, Bill, who is from Massachusetts. So when I was in a local bookstore and I saw this actually very arresting cover, I really was drawn in by the cover and realized that this was a story that was set in Boston. It was about the Irish community. It was about ending segregation in schools. All of it seemed like the perfect combination for me. The one thing that wasn't quite so perfect was the fact that it was kind of this thriller genre. So there is something, in the wide world of literature known as genre fiction. So you have fantasy, you have sci-fi or speculative fiction, you have romantic fiction, you have thrillers/crime novels, and then you have like literary fiction. There's also a whole thing that used to be called chick lit, and now we call it book club lit. And these categories are obviously like arbitrary and kind of strange, and lots of books kind of cross over. Dorothy Sayers is popping into my mind right now because she is someone who writes mystery/crime/thrillers, but they are highly literary in terms of their prose. And for me, part of the reason why sometimes this genre fiction doesn't work as well is it is often motivated by plot. If we have a crime novel, a thriller, obviously plot is very important. That tends to be the same with science fiction, tends to be the same to a large extent with fantasy, slightly less so maybe with romance. I think there we have, more ambiance that's being cooked up and maybe more character development, although plot is still very important. So one of the things I like best about dipping into these genres is when I find how satisfying these elements are that usually are not very important to me. That is to say that plot is not hugely important to me. My memory is really bad. And when I say that, people are like, that can't be true, but it is definitely true. And actually, it's kind of a boon when it comes to fiction because I will remember like, oh, I love that book, but I won't remember anything about it. And so then I'll read it and be like, oh my God, like the plot is always so surprising to me. And I will say that my experience with Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane was so positive. So quick note on the lecture today, there will not be any spoilers. That would be really uncool if I did a lecture and like gave you all the spoilers when it's like a mystery novel. What we're going to talk about today are the elements that make this book so successful, in my opinion, and also some of the elements that he is weaving in that are not necessarily sort of typical of the genre, but that are really compelling. So maybe a good place to begin is this idea of the crime novel. It was so odd. I was looking at one point something on Amazon. I was looking for some sort of information. And weirdly, Amazon has this like subtitle. The little description of it says, Small Mercies, a detective mystery. And I was like, what? That cannot be the actual subtitle of the book. And sure enough, I went to my copy and I looked and there is no subtitle. And it is certainly not a detective mystery. The reason why that seemed so absurd to me is because this really is not a book that is focusing on a detective. Often that is the case, when you look at Agatha Christie or even Dorothy Sayers, the person whose perspective we are following most closely is the detective. So often in a crime novel, thinking of Sherlock Holmes, I think this is true of all those Le Carré novels, that you're really following the detective and your job is to kind of figure out what the crime is. In many ways, this book to me felt much more like a thriller or much more like a suspense novel and a little bit like a mystery. There were some elements that we learned right at the beginning that you are trying to find answers for as you are moving through the text, but mostly it is a story, I would argue, of revenge. And that is not giving anything away. Right from the very beginning, if you read the jacket copy, it tells you that Mary Pat Fennessy, who is our protagonist, that she's having a really bad time this one certain summer. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. For those of you who like an agenda, we're going to talk today about how this book is very much historical fiction. We're going to talk about how one of the best things about this, and the book really leads with this, you see this right in the jacket copy, is that this is very much a novel about a specific milieu. So it's not only set in a specific place and time, but that place and time is hugely important in terms of everything in the novel, the action, the character development, the arcs, everything about it is inflected by the fact that this takes place in Boston in the 70s. We're going to talk about dialogue. Lehane is so good at dialogue. It will not surprise anyone, and probably it will delight a lot of you to hear that Apple TV Plus has already bought the screen rights for Small Mercies. Dennis Lehane has said that he has intimated that this is going to be his last book. My sense is that he is going to dedicate himself maybe to more screenwriting. When I see someone who is writing fiction, writing a novel like this, and they're really good at dialogue, part of me is like, why are you not writing screenplays? So I think that is essentially what is happening here. Many of you know that Mystic River, which was one of his big ones, and Shutter Island, and there are a bunch of his works that have been adapted to the screen. And I think part of that is because he is so good at dialogue. So we're going to take a close look at why the dialogue is so good. We're then going to move on and talk about the plot. I'm not going to spell out the plot for you by any means, but we're just going to talk about a couple of important aspects of the plot. And then I want to talk about this as a revenge story and why this particular revenge story is really different from many and why I found that so inspirational. Before we dive into that, I'm going to give you a 30-second bio about Dennis Lehane. He was born in Boston. Both of his parents emigrated from Ireland, which is important. His father was a foreman at Sears. His mom worked as a cafeteria attendant in the Boston public schools. He was born in Dorchester, which is one of these communities very much like Southie, like South Boston, where you do have a lot of poverty, you have not a lot of resources, you have not a lot of opportunity. He was the youngest of 5 children. And I really actually liked hearing all of that. This was my suspicion. You really get the sense that this is someone who knows what he's talking about and someone who's really invested in articulating some of the difficulties and really illuminating some of the difficulties of these communities. Okay, we're going to dive in. If you are someone who is here to become a better reader, the best advice is simply to pay more attention. And obviously you want to pay attention, just take a beat and think a little bit about the title of a book. Any book worth its salt is going to have a title that's going to tell you a lot about where you should be focusing your attention, about what is going to unfold. Often it will tell you things about style. It can be very revealing. So in this case, Small Mercies, I really liked it. It really drew me in. To me, the idea of mercy really does, especially if I'm thinking about it in terms of Ireland and I'm thinking about it in terms of this area of Boston, it does feel very religious to me. I am not someone who is particularly religious, although I love ceremony. I love rites. I love the anthropological side of all kinds of faith. And I'm actually very jealous of people who have the gift of faith. It also has the sense of small mercies just as everyday life. We say thank God for small mercies. So this title to me is really speaking of this idea of religion or of faith, the kind of best parts of faith, the fact that you might have, some sort of mercy, some sort of salvation, some sort of absolution, that all of that it can be very small. It can be, dispersed throughout someone's life. It doesn't have to be this gigantic reprieve or absolution. It can be these very small things. In many ways, it is a book that deals with the very granular, very domestic aspects of life. In some ways, the scale of it feels very small, but also the scale of it feels very large in terms of the historical underpinnings, which we are going to look at in a minute. I was a little bit frustrated. The very last line of the book talks about minor miracles, and part of me, I think maybe I would have thought it was a little bit cheeseball if it ended with small mercies. But there was part of me that was waiting the whole entire time to have someone say small mercies. In fact, I would have really liked Mary Pat Fennessy to have said it, or Bobby, who is the detective, who's our other sort of heroic character. I love when I am reading through and I find the title verbatim. And sadly, that did not happen. Small Mercies did not pop up anywhere in the text. And then at the very end, when we had Minor Miracles, I was like, oh shoot, Minor Miracles seems so close to Small Mercies. So this is my own personal frustration with it, because otherwise I think it is an excellent title. I also really like the cover art and the way that this whole thing is set up. So we have this very bold those of you on the YouTube, I'm going to hold it up for you. We have a very bold font, which I really like very much. You know, Dennis Lehane is a big deal, and you know that he's, selling novels because of who he is, because the fact that his name is just as big as the title itself. I like the fact that there's a division in this book. You can see from the spine here that we have the yellow and the blue, and they're kind of, in a very kind of linear way, they're cut into two, because this is a book that is very much about division. I don't think they could make it like orange and green in some sort of like very Irish kind of way. The orange and green, of course, representing the Protestants and the Catholics. But I also think that would have been a little bit too on the nose and would have pointed, I think, a little too strongly to the idea of Ireland, when in many ways this is a very American book. This is not a piece of Irish literature. The one thing I do really want to point out, though, is the image on the front is incredible to me. Part of it is because I was 4 years old in 1974. No, I wasn't. Oh my gosh. I was, maybe in 1974, I was 4 years old for the very last half of that year, for the very last couple of months of that year. But I was a young child in the 70s. And this t-shirt with this font and these plaid pants, kind of like a little bell-bottom pant thing that this kid is wearing on the cover of the book, also his like kind of bowl cut haircut, all of this was so nostalgic for me in a way that I really loved. It also, in a very like dark way, in a very heavy way, is this incredible image, because you have this small child who looks very defiant. I mean, he's not super small, he's probably like 10 or something. But he is someone who, the back of his t-shirt reads Southie, God's country. So you have this real sense of him as being really already totally inculcated and totally caught up in the divisions of these neighborhoods. And his stance is very defiant. You have a sense that he's kind of like a young soldier who has already bought into this strife. The other thing that's so interesting is that you have these horseback policemen, which really, because they are so much taller than he is, we don't actually see them. I'm not sure, they might be like state police. I don't know exactly who those people are. But you do have some regular like police people over here in the corner. And way back in the distance here, you can see kind of like a whole group of people. So this is a photograph that was taken by someone named Eugene Richards. And this is an actual photograph of the protests that were happening outside South Boston High School. So obviously I assumed that this was a shot that this was a photograph that had to do with South Boston, but it really deepened my appreciation to realize that it was actually of those protests that were happening in September of 1974. This is a very good segue into the idea of this novel as being historical fiction. And honestly, it's always so shocking when something is historical fiction and it happened in my lifetime. I did a lecture one time on an Ellen Hildebrand novel, and it took place in 1969. And much was made of the fact that that was like 50 years before. And I was like, oh my God, that's like a half century. 69 was the year I was born. I was like, oh my gosh. Apparently now my life, encompasses historical fiction. So in many ways, for many readers, this doesn't feel like it's that far away. And it's a little shocking to realize that this was 50 years ago. I want to go ahead and read the historical note that Dennis Lehane includes in the book. It is very well done, and I think it's very important in the sense that it really is grounding us in the text. And it's really, coming straight, right on the front of the book, it says it's a novel. It's not claiming to be like a historical treatise or even, some kind of like nonfiction thing about this. But the fact that he's leading with this historical note is really leading with the idea that a lot of this is true. And I found it really impactful. Generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of historical fiction. When it is well done, it's incredible. I love Hilary Mantel. I never know if it's Mantel or Mantel. I actually think it's Mantel. I think most of us Americans like hypercorrect there. Or Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, which is being made into a movie right now. That is an incredible piece of historical fiction. Lots of times historical fiction feels kind of forced in a way that is not that pleasing. This was an excellent example of historical fiction, and part of that is because he's kind of getting all of this out of the way at the beginning. He's establishing the historical facts, and it really gives a huge amount of kind of depth and gravitas to the rest of the fiction. So we have here, before we even begin the book, historical note. On June 21st, 1974, U.S. District Court Judge W. Arthur Garrity Jr. ruled in Morgan v. Hennigan that the Boston School Committee had systematically disadvantaged Black school children in the public school system. The only remedy, the judge concluded, was to begin busing students between predominantly white and predominantly Black neighborhoods to desegregate the city's public high schools. The school in the neighborhood with the largest African American population was Roxbury High School. The school in the neighborhood with the largest white population was South Boston High School. It was decided that these two schools would switch a significant portion of their student bodies. One quick note here, I really like how this is written too. I love the parallelism here. And again, the kind of gravitas, it's really well done. So then he continues, this order was to take effect at the beginning of the school year on September 12th, 1974. Students and parents had less than 90 days from the date of the ruling to prepare. It was very hot in Boston that summer, and it seldom rained. So I found this really so well done. I love how in the middle there's that parallelism between the high schools. It feels kind of ominous the way that he draws out that information between Roxbury High School and South Boston High School, and that kind of kicker at the end about how hot it was and how it seldom rained. What he's talking to there really is like this idea of pressure. Rain, in the summertime can be very cleansing. It can be very nourishing. This sense of unrelenting heat and the way that it would really exacerbate the situation is really well done. So in addition to the really well done historical note, there are also a lot of elements that this instantiation of historical fiction is so strong. In some sense, it's simply because it's so highly relatable. I mean, most people in the United States have gone to high school. Lots of them have gone to public high school. I myself went K through 8th in public schools, and then I've navigated public schools as a parent. So all of us have experience of American public schools, and all of us have experience of high school one way or the other. So this is a kind of historical fiction as opposed to something like Hamnet, which is amazing. And apparently it's going to become my touchstone for historical fiction today. Maggie O'Farrell has a different challenge because that is not familiar to people. And the way that Dennis Lehane is taking advantage of this idea of everyone having the experience of high school is excellent. He's not giving us too much information about the young people. It's sort of just the right amount to evoke the experience of high school, back to school shopping and kind of that feeling of the end of the summer. All of that is really well evoked without leaning too hard into it. Another of the very relatable aspects here is this idea of Boston. Obviously, a lot of people who are from Boston and are from Massachusetts are going to get a particular charge out of this book. But even for people who have just visited Boston once or even know anything about it, I think that the kind of common knowledge is that it's very historical, that we have Plymouth right nearby. It was one of these very, very old colonial settlements. I think a lot of people know that it's a very segregated place, that the Irish community and the Italian community and the Black community, I think there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of acknowledgement that even still, these are communities that are more segregated than they should be. I myself, there were a couple of parts of the book that really resonated. One of them was when there was a part about the MDC, which is that's a governing body that takes care of all the parks and all of the a bunch of the public spaces in Boston. And I really loved hearing about that because that is where my father-in-law, Bill Sr., worked for his entire lifetime. But even if you don't have a father-in-law who worked for the MDC, Dennis Lehane's depiction of Boston is also so good. A lot of it when he's evoking these stores or even streets, a lot of it seemed very evocative to me. Just using the proper nouns was very effective. And those are stores that I was not familiar with, but he did a really good job of evoking all of these things. He also, and this doesn't really fit under the umbrella of historical fiction, actually it does. He did an amazing job talking about racism. We're going to look at that a little bit later. But I can tell you that one of the things about the book, it was very uncomfortable for me. I kept noting this and really sort of thinking about this idea that Mary Pat Fennessy is this woman who we have a lot of sympathy for. And we learn enough about her backstory to understand why she has some really unfair and unjust views of entire populations. But her use of language was so difficult. Throughout the whole thing, when people were using slurs to talk about other groups of people, I was just it really shook me. And I know that is the way that we were all speaking in 1974. I think these are words that we just didn't have the sort of sensitivity about that we do today. And I'm sure some of you think that we're oversensitive. I would actually argue that it is very good to take a very close look because words are very powerful and words really can shape someone's sense of themselves. So it was a very complex thing because she really used a lot of words that were very difficult for me to hear, and she used them in this very casual way. But I think that the way that he handled a lot of these things, a lot of the sort of personal arcs of these characters were really impressive because they were not overdone. We're not seeing like transformations that seem pretty unlikely. This idea of slang is also a very good way to speak about the incredible way that Dennis Lehane, I keep looking over here because the book is sitting here and his name is right there. Not that I need to be reminded of his name, but that's a very good way to segue into the really impressive job he does with evoking this certain time and place. So I mentioned some of the general details. It was interesting to me how much those proper names really did evoke things. Like when you have Commonwealth, it really does evoke this idea of like, the underpinnings of our government and like a very old place. I have to admit right now that I did not know that England still has a Commonwealth. We are not part of it, but there is a Commonwealth that is made up of like these old colonies. It's like Canada and Australia and a bunch of different places where you can work in these places if you're part of the Commonwealth. That was a real shocker to me. I realized this like 7 years ago, 10 years ago. But of course, we Americans, we are not part of that Commonwealth. But having it be evoked so often in the book really did speak to like our colonial underpinnings. And in addition to these proper names, a lot of the slang was so evocative. I think a lot of people, all throughout the United States, whether or not you know people from Boston, there's certain things that we think of like wicked or mint, like wicked mint or wicked smart. Like there's all these different sort of expressions that people know that come from Boston. But once I sort of like dug into some of the dialogue in this book, I realized how well he has captured this. And he's not doing like weird dialect spelling and it's not heavy handed, but there's some very distinct ways, even in terms of syntax. I just really was dying to do some sort of like study of like Irish syntax to see if some of the ways, like some of the cadence and some of the sentence and word order, if some of that had to do with Irish, which that might be a bit of a stretch, but it is very distinct the way that people speak in the novel. One other element that was interesting to me is this is a third person narrator. Right from the beginning, we hear about Mary Pat Fennessy, we hear about it being hot, we hear about the power having been turned off. And all of this is being told through, the eyes of this omniscient third person narrator. So this is a narrator that's very pulled back. This is a narrator that has a lot of information. Occasionally it will tell us how Mary Pat is feeling or some of the other characters. It is somewhat flexible in the sense that sometimes we're in the head of Bobby. And actually, mostly it's those two. We're kind of following closely, like almost on the shoulder of like Mary Pat or of Bobby. We're learning about their homes and their families. But what was interesting to me too is that this narrator, a third person omniscient narrator like this is usually very neutral in terms of language. Like it tries to be this kind of transparent, kind of godlike voice that doesn't really have any particular inflections. But what I really appreciated is that there were quite a few times when this narrator was using either slang or syntax that really sounded very much like Boston to me. So we're going to just look at a couple of pages toward the very beginning of the book. Certainly don't want to spoil anything for you. But I think you'll be able to hear as I read these how much the narrator himself, it does feel like a very male narrator. It's also written by Dennis Lehane. So unfortunately, I think most people's default, insofar as people are gendering their omniscient narrator, I think that kind of like godlike omniscient voice does tend to feel kind of male, as it did for me here. So on page 7, I'm going to read a little paragraph, partially just to show you the prose is really good. I would not be talking about this book if it were really badly written. That is just not, it is not in the spirit of the Fox page to just like shit on books. I am not going to do that here. And I really wouldn't speak about a book unless I felt like it really had some literary merit. So on page 7, we have this. A tiny clap of thunder shakes the floor beneath their feet, rattles through the walls, and the lights come on above the stove. The fans start moving in the windows, radios and TVs in the other apartments return to battle with one another. Someone whoops. Jules shrieks, "I call shower," and bolts from her chair like she owes it money. So this is this kind of expression that is not a neutral expression. This is like, someone who's talking about debt, someone who's talking about owing someone money. I like how inventive it is. I don't know if this is like an expression that like a lot of people used or if this is like entirely made up by our narrator here, but it is the kind of expression that you might hear someone in the book using So we have this very clever way where the narrator ends up feeling almost like a character unto himself, which for me really enriched the experience. Part of that is because we know if this is a narrator who's coming up with expressions like this and sounds like someone who might be like living with all of these people, we can really like that he gains some credibility. This is someone who knows this area and knows these people and knows what it's like to live in these kinds of circumstances. I also, I just have to say, I'm looking right across the page here on page 6, and he's talking about Jules and how she has long, smooth hair. And he says it's long, smooth hair, the color of an apple. And I was like, what? Dennis, I cannot follow you there. I'm like, mostly I just think of an apple as being like red delicious, or literally green. Like I went to like, her hair is obviously not green, and it's not like apple for a teacher red. And I honestly, like, I spent a little time. I'm like, what color hair could she have that's like, like an apple? I came to the conclusion that he means golden delicious, which we actually have a tree of golden delicious apples. They suck in the market. I mean, they are not great when you buy them. They're so good off the tree. It's incredible. But as opposed to red delicious, the golden delicious, they're kind of like a color that I guess someone's hair could be. We're talking about blonde hair. But that was one of the few times in this book where I like really was like, oh my gosh, Dennis, wait, what's happening? Okay, we're going to take a look at 2 quick passages of dialogue. We're looking at these specifically because he is so good at this. So, as we are reading through these, one thing to think about here is that dialogue should do all sorts of stuff. Dialogue, when it is well done, will really do much more than just tell you about a conversation. So, it really should be bolstering this idea of milieu, of time and place. It should be developing characters. It's really one of the most efficient ways to tell us about people without telling us about people. It also will move the plot forward. It will tell us about interpersonal dynamics. It's really crucial, and good dialogue kind of effortlessly does all of those things. So we're going to look on page 8 and 9. Again, this is early in the book. We're not spoiling anything. This is Jules talking to Mary Pat Fennessy, Jules of the apple-colored hair. She's the young girl, and she's talking to her mother. There's also something just kind of irresistible about this kind of banter, this kind of syntax, and this word choice. The Boston accent is such a funny thing. I think many of you have seen those commercials where it's like Rachel Dratch and John Krasinski and all of those guys who have I think Casey Affleck. It's an accent that is so distinctive that it literally like turns into these hilarious commercials when people are just talking about parking their car. Honestly, those Dunkin' Donuts commercials, I can't get enough. Or Sam Adams. I mean, people really lean into the accent for a good reason. So what we have on the page here on pages 8 and 9, which we're going to look at, is dialogue that is doing all of the things I just mentioned, but also it is really evoking this time and place and this whole group of working class people without being too belabored. I mean, sometimes you get the feeling that someone's like showing off a certain type of language or a certain type of accent or a certain dialect. And what Lehane is doing is just very effortlessly giving us all everything we want from the accent without it being too heavy-handed. Okay, so on pages 8 and 9, I am not going to read this with the accent. That would be absurd. On that note, the audio version of this book is excellent. The woman who reads it is so good. This is a real challenge in many ways because she has to be men's voices and she has to be women's voices. And frankly, she has to say a lot of words that I would be uncomfortable saying. Obviously, she needs to do all of that because it's part of the book. She's not going to be like our word. But the thing that she does maybe I think best is that she does do the accent. Like she's very good at the Boston accent, but she doesn't overdo it. It feels very organic and it's just very well done. Okay, so on page 8 at the bottom we have this. Jules comes back into the living room in her old tartan bathrobe, at least 2 sizes too small at this point, drying her hair. We going? You told me you'd take me back to school shopping. When? Like fucking today, Ma. You doing the buying? Ma, come on, don't fuck with me. I'm not. You notice we don't have a stove? Who gives a shit? You never cook. That gets Mary Pat off the couch with blood in her eyes. I mean, again, that's like the narrator is telling us with blood in her eyes. I mean, that's not just like a standard thing to say. And Mary Pat, who's angry, has blood in her eyes, says, I never fucking cook. Not lately. Because the gas was turned off. Well, whose fault was that? Get a fucking job before I break your head in, Mary Pat says, talking to me like that. I have a job. Part-time don't count, honey. Part-time don't make the rent. Or keep the stove working, apparently. I will knock you into fucking next week, I swear to Christ. Jules raises her fist and dances back and forth in her ridiculous robe like a boxer in the ring, smiling big. So this is so good. I should have warned you about all the F words here. But things like I will knock you into fucking next week, I swear to Christ, to me that is very evocative. And a lot of that just has to do with word order and syntax, or the part above where she says get a fucking job before I break your head in. Like that's a very specific use. It sounds to me very 70s. It's just so well done. So we're going to look at one other little passage of dialogue. This is when Mary Pat has gotten into a fight. And the thing that's happening here that is so impressive is that the dialogue is the main driver of like all the tension that we feel. Well, it's also like giving us a really good sense of the interpersonal dynamics of this very tense moment in the bar. So she's been beating this person up, and a bunch of guys from the bar are kind of breaking up the fight. They drag her to a bar stool. She hears the voice she recognizes say, "Stop, Mary Pat, stop, please." She looks into the Windex eyes of Brian Shea. Oh my gosh, I have to say there. Dennis Lehane one time before also described Brian Shea's eyes as Windex eyes. It's so, if you have something that is so unusual and expressive like that, Windex eyes. I mean, do I like that even one time? I'm kind of medium on it. To me, it takes me out of the story a little bit. It's like so unusual and kind of flashy. I understand what he's doing, and on some level, I'm like, okay, that's a really like a very specific blue that he is evoking. But as the reader, if you're like, okay, wait, Windex, and you're imagining what that blue is like, and then you're imagining the blue in someone's eyes, like to me, there are too many steps there that take me out of just the sentence itself. So the first time around, we had the Windex eyes, and I was like, okay, that's not working super well, but I get it. But then he says it again, and I'm like, no, Dennis, you can't use that twice. Back to the dialogue. She looks into the Windex eyes of Brian Shea. Come on, he says, huh? So like even that huh, like that, like it feels very much like how people speak. She exhales. The men holding her loosen their grip but don't let her go. Tommy, Brian Shea says to the butler, give Mary Pat another of what she was drinking, then give us all a round. Then we're going to skip a line. You can let me go, Mary Pat says softly. Brian cranes his head down to look in her eyes. Yeah? Yeah, I'm good. You're good. He chuckles at that. She's good, he crows to the guys holding her, and the whole bar laughs way too loud. He nods at someone, and the hands, there were at least 6 of them, leave her body. She might have punctured a fucking lung, Pat Kearns says. Bring him to the doc on G, Brian says. Make sure the doc knows he don't get the Cadillac treatment. This one's a Dodge, a used Dodge. They start to drag him out. Brian says, the fucking back door, you dumb fucks. So you can see here what we have this very tense moment where we have Mary Pat, who has really lost control. She's feeling chastened. She's also feeling somewhat supported by all of these people. In many ways, we are understanding all of the different sort of relationships among these people, how they all take care of themselves. They have certain codes. You get the sense that, someone being beaten up so badly they have to be taken to the doctor is kind of like an everyday thing, like take them to the doc on G. So all of that is very flattering to the reader too, because it makes us feel like we understand what they're talking about. We are on the inside of this group of people, which is one of the ways that Lehane's dialogue functions very best. There was a couple of times toward the beginning where we had exposition in dialogue. So that is a crusher. That is deadly. Exposition is just when a writer is telling you stuff, like if they're saying, Jules had hair the color of an apple, that's exposition. Or they're saying that, Mary Pat had to leave the house early because she had to get to work. That's all exposition. Or that Mary Pat worked at a certain place. It's just information that's being imparted. And you never want to do it in dialogue. Just to make that very clear, because it's kind of a subtle concept, I'm going to read the one part where it happens, and I think it's very clear. So I'm just going to change out these 2 names for, I'm going to just call these people X and Y, just so I don't spoil anything. But this is from page 37 of the book. This is very early on. But you can hear that one of the people says something that she never would have said in this conversation, and it is simply to get some information to the reader. And importantly here, this is when Mary Pat's trying to get information about where her daughter was, and she goes to her sister's house. Her sister's Big Peg, and Big Peg brings out Little Peg, and they're trying to get a sense from Little Peg about where Jules of the apple-colored hair might be. So we have this. Little Peg turns her head back to Mary Pat, but lowers her eyes. Well, I mean, X was with Y. Big Peg slaps her daughter on the side of the head. Little Peg barely flinches. You fucking kidding us? Mary Pat says, You mean Y? Yes. The drug dealer, Mary Pat says. Another slap from Big Peg, same place, same velocity. The guy who sold the shit to your cousin that killed him? That guy? You're hanging out with that fucking guy? So this is the first that we learn one of these characters has died of an overdose. But there's no way, I mean, everyone in this house knows that Y is the drug dealer who was responsible for the cousin's death. And so then when we have Big Peg saying like, oh, you mean that certain drug dealer who sold your cousin the drugs that killed him? It feels very contrived because there's no reason for her. I mean, I understand he's attempting here to really like kind of just fold it on in. But when you have a thing where you're like, this person never would have said that, that's just so that I have this information. That's the kind of like that's one of the ways that dialogue starts to feel just kind of cheeseball. Okay, we're going to close by talking quickly about plot and then about this idea of this being a revenge story. So one of the things that's so good about the plot here is we have lots and lots of subplots. So I think many of you remember that thing called the Freytag triangle. You probably don't remember it was called that, but where you have an inciting incident, and then it's like to describe the plot of any story, and then you have rising action, so it goes up, and then you have some sort of climax, and then you have falling action, and then denouement. So you have like this kind of big triangle. That's kind of like a lopsided triangle. I can't really remember what that's called now in geometric terms. But that idea is a very like simplified and in fact kind of like limiting way to look at a piece of fiction. So you want to have that kind of main action happening, and it is happening here. We have this very clear through line. We have this like very, there's a problem in the beginning that we are needing to solve throughout the whole entire thing, and it's very tense and it's very effective. But one of the things that he does so well with plot is there are also a bunch of little smaller arcs that are created as we are moving through. I probably you've heard of this before, but there's this phenomenon called TV mind, like where your mind just is like thinking the way that like a dramatic television series might unfold. And sometimes my TV mind makes me think things are even more dramatic. So at some point early on, I guessed what had happened. I was also treating this a bit like a mystery story. And I was totally sure that the thing that I was guessing was going to be the case. It was also something that was like way too kind of optimistic. The story was way darker than I had guessed, which is actually a very good thing. But it was a very interesting thing because it's not that often that I guess about plot. And the fact that I was like, oh my gosh, wait, I think I figured it out. I think I know what's happening here. Like, I think I solved this mystery for Mary Pat Fennessy. It just showed that I was very invested. I like got very involved with her and like really wanted this one outcome, which was not the outcome. So, and then the other thing I will say with plot is that he did such a good job of really using this historical moment and this historical thing that was happening. I mean, one of the ways to think about plot is like you have a bunch of characters and you want to put them under some sort of pressure. And one of the best ways to do that is to put them in a confined space. That's why that book Bel Canto by Anne Patchett was so good, because if you have people who are all literally in one room, like all sorts of stuff is going to happen. In this case, we have them, we have a lot of people who are confined to one neighborhood, which can end up feeling fairly claustrophobic. But we also have them compressed in terms of time. This time is ticking, something is going to happen when this like big desegregation thing happens. So the plot is just, it's very well done on a whole bunch of different levels. The last thing I want to talk about is this idea of this as a revenge story. So I mentioned before, I'm not like a huge reader of like crime / thriller / mystery novels, but I have to think that the idea of a woman avenging a crime is not super common. And I loved that so much. I mean, Mary Pat Fennessy is really tough. And I loved the fact that we had enough of her backstory to understand why she was so tough. There was an incredibly good description of the ways that domestic violence would shape your sense of the world. It was really an excellent explanation for how damaging that kind of casual domestic violence can be, and the ways that it really damages the self-esteem, the sense of self of the person receiving the abuse. But in many ways, it felt very feminist to me. This was a woman who, she wasn't just like, she's not a type. She wasn't just like heroic. She actually had lots of flaws. And the reader does kind of evolve as she evolves, but I loved the fact that she remained at the center of the story. And because we have her at the center of the story, we were able to look at all of these different issues through the lens of her revenge. So obviously, we're looking at all the class issues, we're looking at all the race issues. The school bus stuff is obviously very germane to her because it seems really threatening that the government is going to make her send her child to a certain school where she thinks that her child will, in fact, be unsafe. It also was a very good window onto the drug epidemic. We had a couple of different ways to look at the drug epidemic. I mentioned before that there was that one of my other favorite characters is this detective who arrives, and he, as well as the young cousin who died of the overdose, they introduced this idea of a lot of people coming back from Vietnam with drug addictions, which sometimes that to me, I mean, yes, I liked it fine, but I felt like we had lots of historical stuff going on with the busing thing. There sometimes it seemed like some of the parts with Bobby and his experience in Vietnam. It made me just feel like Dennis Lehane had like a lot of information and some like good stories about Vietnam that he wanted to include. I feel like they didn't do a ton for me, but they were well done. I also really liked the way that this woman who was avenging this crime was also entering into these worlds. You know, at one point she's together with a bunch of other women who are protesting, and that is a group of people, a group of women who showed what seemed to me like an unusual amount of violence and an unusual amount of toughness. I really appreciated, I think in many ways, you know, when we think of organized crime, whether that be like the Irish mafia or the Italian mafia or whatever kind of organized crime you're talking about, we expect all of the perpetrators of violence to be men. I actually really appreciated the way that we saw not only Mary Pat, but many other women, both among the protesters, among the school parents, among the women in South Boston, even the women at her job. All of these women had this real capability of like revenge, which obviously I'm not like a huge fan of violence, but I really liked the idea of focusing on the way that these women were really powerful and were pushed to such a limit, just pushed so far beyond their edge that they do resort to violence. Although, kind of given the pattern of violence and domestic violence and violence in general, I'm not sure it took too much to push them beyond their edge. I also, the last thing I will say is that he did such a good job of explaining to us why the ending of the story works. So the ending of the story in my mind was like fairly extreme. And it really only worked because of a couple of very important developments. So the plot wasn't like super twisty. It wasn't like you were like, oh my God, I can't believe that's the thing. But it did develop in ways that were very interesting to me. And it was so well constructed. So at the end, we had the best kind of ending, which is one where the reader is somewhat surprised, but it also feels inevitable. So there's an amount of being surprised by something, which is always good in this genre. But then the minute that it happens, you're like, oh gosh, okay, right, of course. So so Dennis Lehane is someone who places a woman in the center of this thing, which I think is unusual, but then he just does this amazing job. I think as he does in all of his other work, I would imagine. I actually have not read anything else by Dennis Lehane. But from the success of those books and the fact that they are made into successful films, all of that makes me think that he must be very good with plot. So I think it's probably a good place to end with this idea of plot. I mean, it's really in some ways where we started. I find it so refreshing when my expectations of a book are not only met, but are surpassed. And in this case, I was so happy to have the experience of reading a book that is very much a crime novel, but one that was engaging in so many different ways and felt in many ways so literary. So I hope this little deep dive today helped you understand why this book deserves all of the hype that it's getting. And thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.